Good morning, guys. Hey, how are y'all? I hope you're doing well. So today's lecture is about the helpfulness of using frameworks to think about and to talk about issues of inequity and justice, especially when you're talking about the isms such as homophobia, disability, racism, classism, those kinds of things. I tend to think of framework as a consistent system that I can use to either share my thoughts about something or to analyze a problem. So for today, there are two frameworks that work really well in the conversation about injustice that I want you guys to think about and learn how to use. The first one is a levels frame, right? So it's a way of using a framework that thinks about individual bias of behavior between one person and another, right? Tokenism, singling out, hiring. Then the next level is organizational or institutional discrimination, which happens when there's some kind of negative treatment for a specific group of people, kind of like profiling or disproportionality or segregation. And then systemic inequity is when kind of lots of systems are interlocked to limit a particular group from advancing. Right? So thinking about the school to prison pipeline here in the United States is a good example of that. So I can give you a couple of more examples. When I think about how the child protection system harbors oppression against people of color, I can talk about how a child protective services worker might hold negative views, let's say, of Native American life on a reservation. And that might lead her to being more likely to remove a child from a household than to use a less traumatic or separating kind of service for them. Or I could talk about, at an organizational level, hiring practices that mean that child protective service workers of color aren't hired very often, and how that can translate into a system of being less invasive with white families than other families, because most of the child protection workers are white. Or I can talk about how the child protective services, schools, and the criminal justice system have criminalized together certain behaviors that mean that kids of color end up in detention at an early age at higher numbers than white kids. And so this frame has allowed me to look at different levels where oppression or othering might happen. This frame is firmly based in an ecological system and really, views day-to-day life, where we understand that an individual is not a little island, not an island of intentions, but rather is part of, an individual, is part of a family, and that's part of an extended family. The extended family is part of a community, and that whole community is part of a society. And those relationships all impact how an individual group is either othered or made to belong. A very different way of framing the problems is to use Iris Young's frame of the 5 faces of oppression. She is outlining for us the ways that discrimination happens. So her 5 faces are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. So by asking myself which face is most at play in a situation, I can begin to not only better articulate what's happened to the people who are involved, but I can also start to decide what I want to do about it. Exploitation, a good example of that is, let's think about corner stores that are out where there are no grocery stores, out in the food desert, and how those stores exploit their neighbors' lack of transportation when they put higher prices on things that you could get at the grocery store much more cheaply. Marginalization, the unemployed in the United States are marginalized when health insurance is provided mainly by employers. While the Affordable Care Act and Medicare and Medicaid all claim to cover some of the gaps that leaves, that system is confusing, and thus poor people are marginalized from decent health care. And that makes them more vulnerable to the kinds of health problems you have if you can't go to the doctors. Poor dental health, diabetes, heart problems, and high blood pressure, just a very few examples of those things. Let's talk about powerlessness a tiny bit. When a system or another person takes away someone's ability to make decisions for themselves, it causes powerlessness. And regardless of how you feel about the prison system, it is specifically designed to leave people powerless. In most states, anyone convicted of a felony ever can no longer vote. And that's just a clear example of disenfranchisement. And then the next one is cultural imperialism. And of course, our history of colonization of cultures in the South by cultures in the global West is monumental and more than we can talk about in any one conversation. But whenever one of us decides that someone is less valuable because their cultural practices don't match ours, then we're practicing cultural imperialism. Social work is guilty of this whenever we feel like we have to go help people in other poorer countries because we believe that they can't get the quality of help from their own culture that we offer. So the very last face of oppression is violence. The most graphic example of using violence to oppress someone is the long history in the United States of using lethal violence against Black men. Whether it was lynching or for talking back or shooting for a minor crime, or just deciding that all Black men out in public without a three-piece suit on are dangerous. Those are all examples and episodes wherein violence is used to keep another group of people down, out, and often to kill them, which is not good. So that's just a brief explanation of those two frameworks. You've got notes in Canvas to help you figure all of that out. And there are a lot of other frameworks out there. These are just two that work really well. If either of them don't work for you, that's fine. I just want you to have an example of how you can use frameworks to do a better job of conveying to people what you're thinking, what you're seeing, or what you've experienced. So until I see you next time, take good care.